The carriage slowed at the top of the hill, and Cecily Hargrove looked out through the rain-spotted glass at Dunmore Park below. The house was the color of old bone, 4 stories of gray Yorkshire stone, windows like narrowed eyes, the long drive lined with bare oaks that had shed their leaves weeks ago and stood now like a row of something warned. A cold November sky pressed flat above the chimneys. Cecily had expected something imposing. She had not expected something so entirely still. The driver said nothing. The footman said nothing. The 2 maids her family had sent with her sat pressed together on the opposite seat, one with her eyes closed and her lips moving. The other watched the house approach with an expression Cecily had last seen on her younger brother's face when the magistrate read the debt schedule aloud. They had been saying it for 2 weeks, ever since the proxy contract was signed. She had heard it at the village assembly on the 23rd of October, when Lady Alderley had leaned toward Mrs. Forsyth behind a raised fan, unaware that Cecily was 3 feet to her left, standing at the punch table without quite enough to occupy her hands. "She won't last a season in that house," Lady Alderley had said, with the certainty of a woman who had organized her compassion into a verdict and found it comfortable there. The poor child. The poor, foolish child. Cecily had set down her glass and looked at the wall and felt nothing in particular, which she recognized as progress. The carriage stopped at the front steps. The door opened. A steward of middle years stood on the top step in a coat that fit him too precisely, the kind of man who had been doing a difficult job for a long time and had arranged his face accordingly. He introduced himself as Havers and directed the footman to see to the trunks with the clipped efficiency of someone who had concluded that ceremonies of welcome were a form of waste. He led her inside. The entrance hall was warm, barely. The staff stood in 2 rows with the practiced stillness of people who had been told not to show fear and were doing their best. Cecily walked between them. She was aware of being looked at with a very specific kind of attention, the attention one gives a person who is about to pass through a door that everyone in the room knows leads somewhere difficult. The housekeeper, Mrs. Doyle, showed her to her rooms. They were large and well-appointed, and smelled faintly of beeswax and something Cecily could not place at first, a kind of herbal staleness, as though the windows had not been opened in some time. She thanked Mrs. Doyle, who thanked her in return with the grave formality of someone grateful to have completed a procedure correctly. The door closed. Cecily stood alone in the center of the room. She had been standing alone in the center of rooms for 2 years now. She had learned that the trick was not to look at the edges, where the spaces where other things used to be were most visible. She looked at the fire instead. It was a good fire. Someone had thought to lay it well. Her father had died in the January before last. They had sold Hargrove Hall by April. By June, her brother Arthur had settled what debts he could settle, and what remained had been a family of 3 in a rented cottage in Derbyshire. Her mother at the window every morning reviewing the correspondence that brought no invitations. Cecily at the kitchen table reviewing the accounts. The estate of her father had been a modest thing, not lavish, but sufficient. And sufficiency had felt like security until the moment it did not. What she had learned from its removal was simpler than she had expected. The things she had believed she could not endure without, she had endured without. The mornings still came. She still rose to meet them. She ate what was available and wore what still fit and did what needed doing. And gradually the discovery that she was still present and still functional had become the ground she stood on. She did not think of herself as brave. Bravery implied a choice. What she had done was simply continue. Because the alternative was not an alternative at all. The Earl of Dunmore had not attended his own wedding. A proxy, a solicitor, 2 signatures, and a registry entry made at the parish church in the village nearest her family's estate, with her brother standing in for the bridegroom. Her mother had wept. Her brother had looked at the floor. Cecily had held the pen and written her name in ink that dried slowly in the October damp, and she had thought, "Whatever comes next, I have survived worse." She had thought, and believed it, that she did not need to be wanted. She needed only to endure. She had been wrong about one thing, she suspected, lying in the unfamiliar dark on her first night in Dunmore Park, listening to the house settle around her. She had not anticipated boredom. She had anticipated fear, or cold, or cruelty in some form she could identify and brace against. What she found on the first day was simply a house that operated without her, and did not seem to know what to do with her presence, and a lord who had not appeared at supper, and a set of rooms that felt borrowed rather than given. On the second night, she could not sleep. The fire had burned low, and the room had grown cold by 2 a.m, and she discovered that her candle had burned to its end. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders, lit a taper from the last of the coals, and went to find another. She had been told the library was on the ground floor, East Corridor. She had not been told it would still be lit. If you have stayed with this story so far, leave a comment below. Knowing you are here makes the telling easier. The door stood a few inches open, candlelight pressing through the gap. Cecily pushed it wider. The room was floor-to-ceiling shelves on 3 walls, a fire that had been fed within the last hour, and a man standing with his back to her at the far end, one hand on the mantel, looking into the flames. He was tall. That was the first thing she registered, not because it surprised her, but because the room seemed built around his height, the shelves adjusted to it somehow. He was in shirt and breeches, his coat discarded over a chair back, his dark hair uncombed. He did not turn when she entered. She should have left. She knew she should have left. Instead, she said, "I beg your pardon. I came for a candle." He turned then. Julian Ashcroft, Earl of Dunmore, was 34 years old and had the face of a man who had been described as cruel so many times that he had stopped troubling himself to argue it. The jaw was a hard angle, the brow set with what might have been concentration, and what most of the county had settled on as menace. He had gray eyes, not warm gray, but the gray of a sky that has been overcast for several days and has stopped apologizing for it. He looked at her. Cecily looked back. She was aware that she was standing in her husband's library at 3 a.m. in her nightgown, with a shawl pulled around her and a burned-out taper in her hand, which was not an auspicious beginning, but she had run through several scenarios on the walk down the corridor and had concluded that she would meet whatever she found with equanimity, because equanimity was the only tool she had left, and she had become quite good with it. He said nothing for a long moment. "The candles are on the left sideboard," he said finally, his voice level and unexpectedly quiet for a man of his size. "Thank you," she said. She crossed to the sideboard. She found the candles. She lit one. She was aware of him watching her with a stillness that was different from the stillness of the house, which was the stillness of absence. His stillness was the stillness of attention. On the shelf nearest the sideboard, between 2 volumes of agricultural history, sat a small music box of lacquered wood, dark red, no larger than her 2 hands set side by side. Cecily looked at it for a moment. There was a small key in the side. She reached for it without thinking, the way one reaches for something that has caught the eye, and wound it 3 turns. It played a phrase of 5 notes, thin and sweet and slightly fragile, the way old music sounds when it has not been played in a long time. She heard him go very still across the room. Not differently still. More still. She withdrew her hand from the music box carefully. She did not look at him. She stood with her lit candle and waited. Because she had learned that waiting is sometimes the only honest response to a situation you do not yet understand. He did not cross the room. He did not speak. After a moment, he turned back to the fire. "Good night, my lord," she said. "Good night," he said, his voice unchanged as though he were confirming a report. She left. She did not look back. She lay in the dark for another hour, the candle burning steadily, and thought about the way his body had gone still, and what it meant that he had not taken the music box from her, and what it said about a man that 3 notes of music could make him hold his breath. Morning in Dunmore Park began at 5, or earlier if you were the kitchen staff. Cecily had always been an early riser, a habit of her father's house that had survived the dismantling of her father's house, and she was dressed and walking the lower corridors at 6:30 when she heard the sound from the kitchen passage. A short, bitten-off cry, then quiet, the particular quiet of someone trying not to make another sound. She went toward it. The young maid had been reaching for something on an upper shelf when the pan had come loose, catching her across the back of the hand on its way down. She was 15, perhaps 16, sitting on a low stool with her hand pressed against her apron, and her face very composed in the way that people's faces go composed when they are deciding whether they are allowed to cry. "Let me see," Cecily said. The girl, Kit, looked up. Behind Cecily, the cook hovered with the expression of a woman uncertain of the protocol. The cut was not deep, but it needed washing and binding. Cecily borrowed the cook's clean cloth and directed the binding herself, speaking quietly and practically, telling Kit to keep pressure on it, telling the cook to send for Mrs. Doyle with the salve kept in the East medicine cupboard, explaining in 3 sentences what needed doing and why. Kit had stopped holding her breath. The panic in the kitchen had organized itself into competence, which is what panic usually wants when someone will simply tell it where to go. Cecily was mid-sentence when Kit's eyes went to the doorway and stayed there. She turned. Julian Ashcroft stood in the kitchen passage in his riding coat, having apparently come in from the stables at this precise and inconvenient hour. He looked at the scene before him. He looked at Kit. He looked at the bound hand. He looked at Cecily. She looked back at him and finished her sentence, which was an instruction to the cook about the salve. He said nothing. He stood in the doorway a moment longer, and then he moved through the kitchen without speaking, and was gone. By evening, something had shifted. Not in anything he said, because he said very little at supper, which was laid for 2 in the small dining room off the east corridor, a concession to the household's reduced state that the housekeeper had made without comment. He asked her, once, whether her rooms were comfortable. She said they were. He asked if she had found everything she required. She said she had, for the most part. He said that if anything was lacking, she should tell Mrs. Doyle. She said she would. It was not, by any reasonable measure, a conversation. He was present in a way she had not expected, and she was aware that awareness was operating in both directions across the table, though she could not have said how she knew this. The autumn dinner came at the end of the 2nd week. 20 guests from the surrounding county and 2 from London, and Cecily wore the ivory gown that was the best she owned, and sat at the foot of her husband's table for the first time, which was a thing she had prepared herself for in the abstract, and found somewhat different in reality. Lady Vane had arranged the seating. Lady Vane had arranged nearly everything, Cecily had learned. She was Julian's maternal aunt, a woman of 55 with the posture of a monument, and the eyes of a woman who had been running a large operation for a long time and was not certain she approved of the new management. She had arrived at Dunmore Park 9 days ago from her house in Durham, carrying 1 maid and 4 trunks, and a manner so thoroughly convinced of its own authority that the household had rearranged itself around her, the way water rearranges itself around a stone it has been finding ways past for years. She had taken one long look at Cecily at their first introduction, and said, with exquisite courtesy, that she was certain the Countess would find everything she required for a comfortable stay. A comfortable stay, as though Cecily were a guest and Lady Vane the proper resident. Cecily had thanked her with equal courtesy and stored the information. Miss Adeline Crown sat to Lady Vane's right at the dinner, 21 and quite beautiful, with a manner so perfectly calibrated to warmth that Cecily could not decide whether it was genuine or practiced, which might in fact be the same thing at a sufficient skill level. Cecily had gathered from the conversations around her, expected to receive an offer from Julian in the spring. Before the death of Lady Vane's correspondence with her family had quietly gone cold, following the surprise of the proxy marriage in October. She bore this with a composure that Cecily genuinely respected. She had come to the dinner anyway. She wore ice blue silk and sat in Julian's eye line, not his wife's. Cecily's gown was ivory. It was not ice blue silk. She was aware of this in the way one is aware of minor disadvantage, with clarity and without particular feeling. Miss Crown spoke to Cecily twice during dinner, both times with a kind of precise solicitude that managed to convey sympathy and condescension in the same syllable. She asked if Cecily found the Yorkshire winters difficult to manage. She asked if Cecily had had occasion to visit the music room. Cecily answered pleasantly. Across the table she heard Mrs. Beaumont's voice pitched low, directed at Miss Crown's ear during a moment when the general conversation had lifted. "She won't last a season in that house," said Mrs. Beaumont, and there was almost a tenderness in it, the tenderness of a verdict one finds regrettable but necessary. "He will wear through her in 6 months. And then, where will the poor creature be?" Cecily reached for her glass. The wine was very good. She looked at the arrangement of candles in the center of the table and thought about the music box and about the way the Earl had stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her finish a sentence. And she thought that they were describing a man she did not yet recognize. It was 3 days after the dinner, on a gray afternoon with rain coming in across the moor, that Julian came to the library where she had stationed herself with a stack of estate accounts she had asked Havers for, and Havers had surrendered with visible surprise. Julian stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment. "Come with me," he said. She came. He took her to a gallery on the 2nd floor, a long room with tall windows and 3 portraits hung at intervals on the facing wall. He stopped before the center one. The woman in the portrait was perhaps 25. She had light hair arranged in the fashion of a decade prior, a round and pleasant face, and the expression of someone sitting for a portrait very patiently. She was not beautiful in the way that beauty is usually described, but she had a quality of presence the painter had caught, something in the set of the eyes. Cecily waited. "Her name was Eleanor," he said. "Eleanor Ashcroft. She was 22 when we married." She kept her eyes on the portrait. "She was ill when we married," he said. "She had been ill for 2 years and had concealed it from her family and from me because she had decided she was beyond the reach of family planning anyway, and she wanted a particular life with a particular kind of man before the consumption finished what it had started." He said it without inflection, the way one recites a series of facts that have been recited before, internally, many times. "I knew within a month. I did not tell anyone because she did not want me to, and because she was not asking for pity, and because telling people would have taken the small portion of her life that was still her own, and given it to other people's reactions to it." He turned away from the portrait. His hands were clasped behind his back. He looked at the rain against the window. I withdrew from the season because she was not well enough for it. I stopped accepting invitations because she could not always stand long enough to attend them, and I would not go without her. I refused 3 physicians who came from London with opinions she had not asked for. The house went quiet because she needed quiet. He paused. The world looked at all of that and decided it was cruelty. It decided that the quiet was punishment, and the withdrawal was control, and the refused visits were isolation. And it told a story that was coherent and damning and entirely wrong. And I have not corrected it. Why not? Cecily asked. Because correcting it requires explaining her. It requires putting Eleanor in front of a room full of people who did not know her and asking them to revise their feelings about a woman who has been dead for 3 years. And I cannot stomach it. He turned to look at her. I told you that because you asked about her directly. You said what happened to her, not was it as bad as they say. You asked about her. She is the one in the portrait, Cecily said. Yes. You loved her. Yes. The word sat between them for a moment, plain and without ceremony. She was aware of the distance between them, perhaps 6 feet, and of the way the afternoon light fell across the side of his face, and of her own breathing, which had slowed at some point in the last several minutes without her noticing. He was very still, the way she had come to recognize his stillness now, which was not the stillness of nothing happening, but the stillness of something being held carefully. She could see the muscles of his jaw and the way his hands had loosened from their clasp behind his back, one of them now at his side, fingers slightly open. She was aware of wanting to close the 6 feet, and was aware of not doing it, and was aware that these 2 things were the most honest account of where she stood. What she had instead of words was the understanding that this man had carried something very heavy for a very long time, and had told her the weight of it, not because he needed relief, but because she had asked without flinching, and that something in that exchange had changed the particular quality of the air between them. The story the county told was a story about cruelty. The man in front of her was a man who had sat in a sick room for 2 years rather than parade a dying woman's illness for sympathy. These were not the same person. She had suspected this, and now she knew it. And knowing it was not a small thing. I did not love Edmund Hargrove, she said, because it seemed fair. He looked at her. My father. I did love him, but not with grief when he died. I had been watching him disappear for 2 years before the end. What I felt when he was gone was something quieter than grief. Something like the end of bracing. She looked at the portrait. I came here expecting to brace indefinitely. I have been waiting for the blow that the whole county assured me was coming. And I have not yet found what they described, she said. I have found someone I do not know. That is a different matter. He was quiet for a long moment. You are not afraid of me, he said. It was not a question. I do not yet know enough about you to be afraid of you specifically, she said. I am afraid of some things. Poverty. Being without purpose. The feeling of rooms that used to hold more than they hold now. She looked at him. You have not given me reason to add you to the list. He looked back at her. Something in his face was different, though she could not have said what. Precisely. It was the difference between a door that is closed and locked, and a door that is closed but not locked, which is a distinction that matters. He turned and led her back down the corridor. He did not speak again that afternoon. When she returned to the library, the small music box had been moved from its shelf between the agricultural histories and set instead on the corner of the reading table, in the light, where she would see it. She sat down and looked at it, and understood that it was not a gesture he would repeat. Lady Vane had been managing things for 3 years, and she was very good at it. She had managed the household through Eleanor's illness and through the year of Julian's grief, and through the subsequent 2 years of his increasingly isolated guardedness, and she had arranged herself around him as someone arranges the furniture of a room one loves, with the confidence of long occupation and the silent conviction that one's arrangements are improvements. She had also, in the way of women whose love is partly possessive, come to believe that Julian's future required a choice she had already identified, and that choice was Miss Adeline Crown, who had a substantial fortune, a family connection to 2 different dukedoms, and the quality of adaptability that Lady Vane had come to consider the cardinal virtue. Cecily had understood all of this within the first week. She had not found it threatening, exactly. She had found it clarifying. The gathering that Lady Vane engineered in the 3rd week of November was called a card party, but it was assembled with a precision that had nothing to do with cards. 20 guests, the same 20 as the autumn dinner, plus Mr. Prewitt, Julian's solicitor, who had been invited under cover of an estate matter and was therefore present with legal authority built into his standing without his being aware of it. Cecily wore the ivory gown again because it was still the best she owned and because she had stopped apologizing for her wardrobe in approximately August. The evening went pleasantly enough for 2 hours. Cecily played whist badly and did not mind. Julian moved through the room with the contained economy of a man who has learned that rooms full of people are something to be survived, not enjoyed. Lady Vane circulated. Miss Crown sat in the circle of warmth she generated wherever she sat. At 9:30, Lady Vane rose and said that before they continued with the cards, she wished to share something that had come to her attention, as she felt the assembled company, as friends, ought to be aware of the circumstances of the match before them. She said it with the gravity of a woman who has decided that what she is about to do is justified by the depth of her concern. She produced a letter. She read it aloud. It was from Cecily's brother, Arthur. Cecily recognized his handwriting from across the room before a word was spoken. The letter said that Cecily had entered the arrangement under considerable family pressure following the settlement of their father's debts, that she had done so without full information as to the Earl's circumstances or character, and that it was Arthur's belief, having reflected on the matter, that the match should be reconsidered. Every word of it was true. Every word of it had been written in their mother's sitting room in October by a brother who loved her and was frightened for her, and had said these things to her face before he had the sense not to write them down. And she had said, "Arthur, I am not going to ask for a reconsideration. I am going to go to Yorkshire and find out what is actually there." She had thought he had understood that. She had not known he had written it down as well. The room was very quiet when Lady Vane finished reading. Julian stood near the window. Cecily did not look at him. She looked at Lady Vane, who was folding the letter with the satisfaction of a woman who believes she has done something loving. "I know what the letter says," Cecily said. "I was in the room when it was written. 20 people looked at her. 'My brother loves me and is alarmed on my behalf,' she said, "which is a quality I value in him. It does not alter my circumstances or my choices. I am obliged to you for your concern, Lady Vane." She set down her cards. She stood. She left the room. She walked down the east corridor and into the library, and sat in the chair nearest the fire without removing her gloves. The music box was on the corner of the table where Julian had placed it. She looked at it. She looked at the fire. She had been calm in the drawing room because calm was the only thing she trusted herself to produce, and because she had understood that Lady Vane was not cruel, merely desperate, and that gratifying a desperate person's hope of a reaction is the least sensible thing one can do, She had left because staying was not an option that any pride she had remaining could endorse. She had left, also, because she had felt the particular quality of her own composure beginning to reach its limit, the way a held breath reaches its limit, and she would not let the room see it. But the library was private, and she was alone. She sat with her gloves still on and her hands folded, and looked at the fire, and let herself notice the things she had not let herself notice in the drawing room. Julian had stood near the window. He had said nothing. He had not come to her side, had not interposed himself, had not produced the precise small intervention that the last 3 weeks had been quietly accumulating toward in her mind. She had watched him do nothing, and she had turned and walked out. And in the corridor she had been aware of a sensation in her chest that she had not felt in 2 years, since the day the magistrate read the debt schedule aloud and her mother had made a small sound beside her. She had been wrong to begin wanting. That was the truth of it. She had told herself she was beyond wanting. And then, without noticing when it started, she had begun to want. And now the wanting had somewhere to be refused, and that was worse than not wanting. She had survived sufficiency's removal. She would survive this too. She sat in the library with the music box on the corner of the table and felt the particular weight of something she had not let herself name until it was taken. She heard it in the corridor, dimly, before she understood what she was hearing. Havers's voice, low and relaying something to the Lord. She caught only a phrase, filtered through the closed door and the thickness of old walls. The London papers, a note in the social column. They are already saying she won't last the season. And Julian's voice, entirely level. Who is saying it? Havers relays what the papers print, my lord. The phrase used was quite like what Lady Alderley was heard to say at the assembly in October, that she won't last a season in that house. A silence. Then the sound of boots on floorboards, moving not away from the library but toward it. The door opened. Julian stood in the doorway. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and she was aware of a pulse in her own throat that she had not been aware of a moment ago. His expression was not the expression she had come to recognize across supper tables, the contained and courteous blankness. It was something beneath that, something that had stopped performing blankness. "Come back to the drawing room," he said. She looked at him. "Now," he said. Not a request. The word was the same short declarative he used for everything. The same register as come inside and sit down. And she had learned in the past 3 weeks to hear what lived underneath those words. What lived underneath this one was something she had not heard before. She stood. She walked to the door. He did not offer her his arm in the corridor. He walked half a step ahead, which was not something he had done before, and she understood that this particular configuration was not an oversight. The drawing room was as she had left it, 20 people arranged in the specific tableau of collective discomfort, the kind that arrives when a scene has gone further than the room planned for. Lady Vane stood near the fireplace with the folded letter at her side. Miss Crown sat very still in her chair with her eyes directed at the carpet. Mr. Prewitt, the solicitor, had risen at some point and was standing against the far wall with the look of a man trying to be less present than he is. Julian crossed the room. He stopped in front of Lady Vane. She looked up at him. Something in her face rearranged itself, some of the confidence leaving it. Not all at once, but in the way warmth leaves a room when a window is opened. Steadily and without announcement. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "The Countess stands where I stand," he said. "I will hear no argument." The room was absolutely still. Lady Vane's mouth opened. Then it closed. Her hand tightened on the letter and then went slack, and the letter fell to the carpet, and she did not pick it up. Julian turned. He looked at Cecily, who stood just inside the doorway. Something moved across his face that was not quite legible. He crossed back to her. He stood before her. He said quietly, for her alone, "Cecily." It was the first time he had used her name. She looked up at him. Her hands were at her sides, and she did not trust them. Her throat felt unreliable. "Mr." Prewitt cleared his throat from his position against the wall. "If I may," he said, "as the Earl's solicitor, I can confirm that the Countess's status is unambiguous and requires no review. The contract is complete and in good standing." He said it with the brisk efficiency of a man glad to find a useful role. "The matter is settled?" Around the room, something shifted, the particular silence of collective attention finding a new configuration. Miss Crown looked at her hands. Mrs. Beaumont looked at the ceiling. Lady Vane stood with the expression of a woman who has been very confident for a very long time and has just arrived somewhere she was not expecting, and who is beginning, slowly, to recalculate. She was not punished. She was not humiliated. She was simply and completely displaced. The architecture of her arrangements made suddenly visible for what it was, a structure that had served its time and was no longer necessary. Cecily met her eyes. She held them for one moment. Then she looked away. "If this story has held you, stay with it. There is a little more." The guests departed within the hour. There was no further card play. There was tea, briefly, and then carriages in the drive, and then the sound of wheels on gravel diminishing until the house was quiet. Lady Vane left last. She paused at the door. She looked at Cecily, and there was in her face, beneath the careful composure, something that might have been recognition. The recognition of a woman who has organized her love into management and is beginning to see that these are not the same thing. "I believed I was protecting him," she said. "I know," Cecily said. Lady Vane looked at her for another moment. Then she nodded, once, with a dignity that was genuine, and went out. The house settled back into its quiet. Cecily stood in the entrance hall alone and felt the quiet differently now. Not the quiet of absence, a different kind. Julian had not appeared since the drawing room. He was in his study. She could see the line of light under the door at the end of the east corridor. She did not go to him. She went to the library instead, because the library was where she had learned to be in this house, and because some things needed time before they were ready to be spoken. She sat in the chair near the fire. The coals had been banked by the housemaid and glowed quietly. Outside the library window, the night was very dark, and when she looked carefully, she could see the first faint movements in the air that meant snow, a sound in the doorway. She had learned his particular step on wooden floors, the slight deliberateness of it, the way weight settles differently when the person carrying it has stopped trying to take up less room. Julian came into the library. He did not say anything. He crossed to the reading table and he picked up the music box. He wound the small key 3 turns. He set it back down. 5 notes. Thin and sweet and slightly fragile. He sat in the chair across from her. Outside the window, the snow was beginning in earnest, those first few flakes that are almost more air than substance, more suggestion than arrival. The fire said nothing, and the music box had gone quiet, and the space between their 2 chairs was precisely the space it had always been. But Cecily felt it differently. The way one feels a room differently, after the furniture has been moved and everything has been returned to its place. She looked at his face. He was looking at the fire. The jaw was the same hard angle. The eyes were the same unapologetic gray. He was not a gentleman, she thought. But he was not what they had said. and she had not needed them to be wrong in order to find that out. She had only needed to stay until she could see him clearly. "You said my name," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at the music box. 5 notes, already fading back into the wood. A 3-year silence. And now this. She thought of all the things she might say next, and selected none of them. There was no sentence that would improve on what the room already contained. She put her hands in her lap and turned slightly toward the fire and let herself be here. In this house. That was now her house, beside this man who was not cruel. While the snow came down outside the window, and the coals said their small and steady things. He did not speak either. He was a man who had learned that words are often the wrong instrument. She was a woman who had been told that silence was loss, and had discovered 2 years ago that it was sometimes simply what remains after you have let go of the thing you had been clutching. They sat together, the fire between them, the window behind them. The music already played. The season would come again in spring. There would be London, and gatherings, and the particular scrutiny of a society that had written its story about him and had not yet been asked to revise it. There would be letters from her brother, she thought, and she found that she was looking forward to writing back. There would be more mornings in the kitchen passage, and more evenings in the library with the estate accounts spread across the table, and Havers would gradually stop looking surprised when she asked questions, and Mrs. Doyle would gradually stop treating her like a guest. There would be all of this, and it would be enough. And it would sometimes be more than enough. Julian reached across the small table that sat between their chairs. He turned the music box once more, 3 turns of the key, and the 5 notes came again into the quiet room, thin and sweet. And outside the window the snow fell in the particular way snow falls when there is no wind. Straight down, soft, as though the world has remembered that patience is a form of attention and settled into practicing it. Cecily's hands were still in her lap. The music played, and then it faded, and the room was warm, and she was not afraid. Thank you for staying until the very end of this story. If something in it moved you, leave a word below. It means more than you know.